The year 1861 arrived like the quiet before a thunderstorm, still, uneasy, and strangely charged. Across the United States, tension had grown for decades as arguments about slavery, the balance of power between states and the federal government, and the expansion of new territories stretched the nation to its breaking point. People felt the strain in newspapers, in political speeches, in conversations overheard in shops and taverns. It was as if everyone sensed that something enormous was approaching, something that would forever change the land they lived in. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860, many in the South felt that their way of life was under threat. Lincoln had promised to stop the spread of slavery into new territories, and though he did not call for its immediate abolition, Southern leaders saw his victory as the final sign that the North's political power had grown too strong. Within weeks, one Southern state after another declared that it would leave the Union. South Carolina went first, its legislators voting to secede with words of defiance and regret mixed together. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed, and by early 1861, the Confederate States of America had been formed with Jefferson Davis as its president. Many Americans watched these events with dread. Farmers, shopkeepers, railroad workers, and factory laborers wondered what it meant for their future. Some thought the crisis might pass without violence, that negotiations might heal the divide. Others, especially those who had followed years of fiery debates in Congress, believed war was now inevitable. In Washington, Lincoln tried to calm the nation, insisting that he had no desire to strike first. But the South, seeing itself as an independent nation, began claiming federal property within its borders, forts, arsenals, and military posts. Fort Sumter, standing in Charleston Harbor, soon became the spark that lit the fire. The U.S. troops inside the fort were running short on food and supplies. When Lincoln announced he would send provisions, only food, no weapons, the Confederate government saw it as a challenge to their authority. On April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on the fort, sending plumes of smoke into the morning sky. For 34 hours, shells crashed against the stone walls until the Union commander surrendered. No soldiers died in the bombardment, but the significance of the event echoed across the entire nation. When news reached the North, crowds filled city streets, singing patriotic songs and calling for the preservation of the Union. Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to defend the country, believing that citizens would rally quickly and decisively. They did, too quickly for many families, who watched sons, brothers, and fathers leave with a mixture of pride and fear. The South responded by raising its own armies, and 4 more states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The divide was complete. The war had begun. Early battles revealed how unprepared both sides were. At the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, Union soldiers marched confidently toward what they expected would be an easy victory. Civilians from Washington even followed in carriages, hoping to watch the action as if it were entertainment. Instead, they witnessed chaos. Confederate troops, led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, stood firm against the Union assault. The battle soon turned into a disorderly retreat for Union forces, their confidence shattered. It became clear that the war would not be the short, bold adventure many had expected. It would be long, bloody, and unforgiving. As 1861 turned into 1862, armies grew larger, strategies grew more complex, and the nation realized that it stood at the beginning of a conflict that would shape its future for generations. No one could have predicted the suffering, the sacrifice, or the transformation that lay ahead. What they did know was simple. The United States, once united, was now 2 nations locked in a struggle that would test its soul. By the time 1863 arrived, the war had become a vast and grinding conflict that touched every corner of American life. Both the Union and the Confederacy had tasted victory and defeat, and neither side showed signs of collapse. What had begun as a struggle over Union and secession had grown into something deeper, heavier, a battle over the future of human freedom itself. And though many soldiers enlisted believing the war would end quickly, they now found themselves trapped in an unending storm of marches, battles, and heartbreak. President Lincoln faced immense pressure during these years. Northern newspapers criticized him for being too cautious or too bold, depending on the political viewpoint. Families wanted the war to end, but generals in the field struggled to deliver decisive victory. The Confederacy, meanwhile, remained determined and resilient, led by Robert E. Lee, whose brilliance on the battlefield won him admiration even from his enemies. Yet the South suffered shortages of food, weapons, and clothing as the Union blockade tightened its grip on Southern ports. In September of 1862, the war reached a turning point at the Battle of Antietam. It was a place of cornfields, quiet bridges, and rolling farmland, transformed in one day into a landscape of unimaginable horror. From dawn until dusk, Union and Confederate troops clashed in ferocious combat. The fighting at the cornfield alone saw men fall by the hundreds every hour. The sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, became a trench filled with smoke, bodies, and desperation. By the day's end, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. No field in American history had ever witnessed such carnage. Yet the Union held the ground, and in doing so, Lincoln gained the moment he needed. In January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in the rebellious states free. With that single stroke, the war transformed. It was no longer only about restoring the Union, it became a war of liberation. Enslaved men and women heard the news with tears, prayers, and quiet disbelief. Many fled plantations, risking death to reach Union lines. Others joined the newly formed United States colored troops, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of millions like them. Their courage reshaped the Union Army and gave the war a moral weight that changed how the world viewed the conflict. But freedom came at a cost. Battles grew even more destructive as 1863 unfolded. Confederate hopes rose when Lee marched his army north into Pennsylvania, seeking a decisive victory on Union soil. The small town of Gettysburg became the stage for one of the most important battles of the war. For 3 days in July, the hills, ridges, and fields near the town echoed with gunfire and cannon blasts. On the second day, Union soldiers clung desperately to Little Round Top, preventing the Confederates from breaking their flank. On the third day, Lee ordered pickets charge, an assault across open fields against fortified Union positions. It was brave, bold, and doomed. Thousands of Confederates fell, and the attack collapsed in defeat. Lee's army withdrew, its momentum broken forever. In November, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new cemetery. His speech lasted barely 2 minutes, yet its message still echoes through history. He spoke of a nation fighting for a new birth of freedom, a future in which government was truly of the people, by the people, for the people. His words honored the fallen and promised that their sacrifice would not fade. By the end of 1863, the war had shifted decisively in favor of the Union, but the end was still far away. The fighting would continue, harder and bloodier than ever, before peace finally returned. The last phase of the war, stretching through 1864 and into 1865, unfolded like the final, exhausting miles of a long and brutal journey. Both armies were worn down by years of conflict. Soldiers marched with ragged uniforms, aching limbs, and memories of fallen friends that weighed on them more heavily than their rifles. Towns and farms, once filled with life, now carried the scars of battles fought and families displaced. Yet despite the suffering, both the Union and the Confederacy pressed on, driven by duty, desperation, and the belief that victory was still possible. In March 1864, President Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all Union armies. Grant was a different kind of general, quiet, relentless, and unshaken by setbacks. He believed the Union's advantage lay not only in strategy but in numbers and resources. If he could keep constant pressure on Lee's army, the Confederacy would eventually reach the breaking point. So Grant launched a campaign that would become one of the most grueling in American history. The first major clash came in the dense woods of the Wilderness. The forest was so thick that soldiers could barely see 10 feet ahead. Gunfire sparked fires that swept through the underbrush, trapping wounded men in burning foliage. Smoke, screams, and chaos filled the air. Grant did not retreat. Instead, he ordered his army forward, determined to keep Lee on the defensive. The fighting continued at Spotsylvania Courthouse, a battle remembered for the horrifying scene known as the Bloody Angle, where soldiers fought hand-to-hand in rain-soaked trenches for nearly 20 hours. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers fell in minutes during a disastrous assault. Grant later admitted that he regretted ordering it. But he pressed on, laying siege to Petersburg, a city whose capture would choke off supplies to Richmond, the Confederate capital. The siege lasted nearly 10 months, with soldiers on both sides facing hunger, disease, and constant danger. Trenches stretched for miles, resembling the future battlefields of World War I more than any conflict Americans had ever seen. While Grant hammered Lee in Virginia, another Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, launched a campaign in the South that would break the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. Sherman marched toward Atlanta, fighting his way through Georgia with fierce determination. After capturing the city, he made a bold decision. He would march to the sea, destroying anything that could aid the Southern war effort. His soldiers tore up railroads, burned factories, and seized supplies. It was a harsh strategy, but it weakened the Confederacy beyond repair. Enslaved people saw the Union Army approaching and left plantations in great numbers, seizing the freedom they had long been denied. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Lee's army was starving, outnumbered, and surrounded. Confederate soldiers deserted in growing numbers, driven by hunger and the knowledge that defeat was inevitable. On April 2, Union forces broke through the lines at Petersburg. Richmond fell the next day, and Confederate officials fled the city, watching smoke rise over their abandoned capital. Lee retreated west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces, but Union troops cut off every route. On April 9, 1865, he arrived at the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. There, in the home of Wilmer McLean, Lee met Grant for the final time. The two generals spoke respectfully as Grant offered generous surrender terms. Confederate soldiers would be allowed to keep their horses for planting crops, and officers could keep their sidearms. Lee accepted, ending the war in the East. As word spread, soldiers on both sides laid down their weapons. Some cried, some prayed, some simply sat in silence, unable to grasp that 4 years of bloodshed had come to an end. A few days later, President Lincoln stood on a White House balcony, speaking to crowds celebrating the long-awaited peace. But on April 14, tragedy struck when he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. The nation that had survived war now mourned the leader who guided it through its darkest days. The Civil War was over, but its legacy would shape America for generations, shaping its laws, its identity, and its understanding of freedom.